Pontiac's warriors were ready to turn Fort Detroit into a slaughterhouse, all under the guise of a friendly peace council. This was 1763's version of a corporate takeover, but with tomahawks instead of hostile memos. The only problem with the flawless plan was an information leak. Someone betrayed the plot, turning Pontiac's masterstroke into a fatal miscalculation before a single shot was even fired. The secret was out, and the ambush was already over. Before the blood, before the betrayal, there was Detroit. Founded in 1701 by a French adventurer, it wasn't so much a city as it was an idea, a stubborn foothold of European ambition parked in the middle of a continent that didn't ask for it. By the 1760s, after the French had lost their war and their influence, Detroit had grown into a surprisingly pleasant place to live. The heart of the settlement was the fort, a compact square of about 100 houses, shops, and a church, all huddled together behind a 25-foot-high palisade of wooden stakes. Beyond these walls, the French-Canadian farms stretched for miles along the river, their narrow plots giving every family a slice of the waterfront. It was, by all accounts, a pretty good life. The 2,500 souls living there existed in a state of cheerful indifference to the wider world. The land was generous, overflowing with wild game, fruit orchards, and rivers choked with fish. The French Canadians were a people who loved to dance, to party, and to live without much concern for the past or the future. They were traders, hunters, and farmers who had carved out a comfortable, almost idyllic existence on the frontier. Their relationship with the neighboring native tribes, the Potawatomi, the Wyandot, and the Ottawa, was one of long-standing familiarity. They weren't just neighbors, they were trade partners, in-laws, and allies. It was a delicate balance, a unique fusion of cultures that had worked for generations. Then the British showed up, and the balance started to tip. When the British military took control of Detroit, they brought a new kind of order. The Redcoats, a mix of regular soldiers and provincial rangers, moved into the barracks, their disciplined routines a stark contrast to the casual lifestyle of the French inhabitants. They saw the fort not as a home, but as a strategic asset. Blockhouses were erected over the gates, and cannons were mounted at the corners, but it was mostly for show. The garrison consisted of only 120 soldiers and about 40 fur traders who could be armed in an emergency. It was a skeleton crew holding down a fort that looked imposing but was, in reality, dangerously vulnerable. Its greatest defense had always been its isolation and its good relations with the tribes. The British, however, had a talent for souring good relations. As if the land itself could sense the coming conflict, strange omens began to appear. Dark clouds would gather for no reason, releasing a black, greasy rain that smelled of sulfur. The superstitious French settlers collected the strange liquid, using it like ink, writing it off as a divine warning of impending disaster. While some tried to find a scientific explanation, most simply accepted it for what it felt like. A bad moon rising. And at the center of this brewing storm was a man the British would come to know as the Satan of this forest paradise, Pontiac, the war chief of the Ottawa. While others saw him as a king, he lived simply, his mind consumed not with wealth, but with a burning ambition to unite the tribes and drive the arrogant British back into the sea. He clung to the desperate, fading hope that his old allies, the French, would return to help him, fatally underestimating the enemy he was about to provoke. The first signs of trouble were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. In the Ottawa village, a Canadian woman buying maple sugar and venison was startled to see warriors openly grinding down the barrels of their muskets, shortening them for reasons they wouldn't explain. The village blacksmith noted that natives had been borrowing files and saws with unusual frequency, all while maintaining a suspicious silence about their projects. For the seasoned French settlers who understood the nuances of the frontier, these were not good signs. These were the telltale preparations for a close-quarters fight. While most of the French had no desire to see a war that would ruin their livelihoods, a few felt a bitter satisfaction watching the British walk into a trap they couldn't see. One of the few who tried to stop it was Monsieur Gouin, a respected elder of the French community. He went directly to the fort's commander, Major Henry Gladwin, and warned him to be on his guard, that the mood in the villages had turned sour. But Gladwin, a man of unflinching, almost reckless courage, politely dismissed the old man's concerns. He saw the natives as a nuisance, not an existential threat, and he wasn't about to lose sleep over village gossip. This easy confidence, this failure to listen, would have doomed every man in the garrison if not for a second, more desperate warning that came on the afternoon of May 6th. Her name was Catherine, an Ojibwa girl who was fond of the major. She came to the fort carrying a pair of moccasins she had made for him, but her face was a mask of grief and anxiety. Gladwin immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. He pressed her, gently at first, then with more urgency, promising that no harm would come to her if she told him what was troubling her. Finally, she broke. The words spilled out, revealing a conspiracy of shocking audacity. "Tomorrow," she explained, "Pontiac will come to the fort with 60 of his chiefs. Each will have a gun, cut short, hidden under his blanket." She laid out the entire plan. Pontiac would call for a council, and after delivering a speech, he would offer a peace belt of wampum, but he would hold it upside down, a prearranged signal for the chiefs to raise their hidden weapons and shoot down the British officers. At the sound of the volley, the warriors waiting outside would storm the gates, slaughter the garrison, and seize the fort. The casual confidence Gladwin had shown earlier evaporated. The vague warnings he had dismissed now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just unrest, it was a meticulously planned extermination. That night, the fort became a hive of silent, frantic activity. Gladwin summoned his officers and laid out the danger. Half the garrison was ordered to arm themselves and remain on duty through the night. The fur traders shuttered their shops and prepared their own men for a fight. Every man knew what the morning would bring. Gladwin himself walked the perimeter of the wooden walls all night, a tense, solitary patrol. From across the dark water, he could hear the unnerving sounds drifting from Pontiac's village, the dull, rhythmic thump of drums and the chilling war cries of warriors psyching themselves up for the slaughter. The plot was exposed. The only question left was whether the warning had come in time. The morning of May 7th broke with a deceptive calm. From the British perspective inside Fort Detroit, the first sign of movement was a fleet of birch bark canoes gliding across the river from the eastern shore. Only a few warriors were visible in each boat, but the canoes sat low in the water, their bottoms packed with men lying flat to conceal their numbers. On the land behind the fort, the commons began to fill with hundreds of native women, children, and warriors. They chattered and moved about with a feigned casualness, as if gathering for a great game of lacrosse. It was a perfect piece of theater, designed to lull the garrison into a false sense of security. Then came the main actors. Pontiac, leading 60 of his chiefs, began the slow walk toward the fort's main gate, each man wrapped tightly in a thick blanket despite the mild spring air, their faces stern and purposeful. Major Gladwin watched them approach. He knew about the hidden guns. He knew the lacrosse game was a diversion. He knew this was supposed to be his last day on Earth. And he made a decision born of pure psychological warfare. He ordered the gates opened. As Pontiac and his retinue stepped inside, the trap they had set for the British was sprung on them instead. The street was lined with soldiers, not standing at ease, but in formation with bayonets fixed. The English fur traders, normally concerned only with profits, stood in clusters with their own armed men, their faces grim. A single drum beat a low, steady, threatening rhythm. The air was electric with tension. One look was all it took. A deep, involuntary gasp escaped Pontiac's chest. He had walked into a fortress that was wide awake and waiting for a fight. The plot was exposed. They were ushered into the council house, a large chamber now crowded with destiny. Gladwin and his officers were already seated, every one of them wearing a sword and carrying pistols openly in their belts. The visual message was unmistakable. We know. Pontiac, struggling to regain his composure, demanded to know why so many of his father's soldiers were standing in the street with their weapons. Gladwin's reply, filtered through an interpreter, was ice cold. It was merely for exercise and discipline, he said, a blatant lie that showed utter contempt for Pontiac's intelligence. The Ottawa chief, now trapped in his own charade, was forced to begin his speech, professing eternal friendship and a desire to smoke the pipe of peace with his English brothers, all while his mind was surely reeling. At the climax of his speech, he fatefully lifted the green and white wampum belt. For a split second, he held it, his hand trembling on the edge of giving the signal that would begin the massacre. But before he could turn it over, Gladwin made a slight, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. In an instant, the council room was filled with the deafening sound of the drum outside, switching to a frantic, rolling battle beat, punctuated by the sharp clash of steel from the soldiers in the street. Pontiac froze, his arms still in the air. The source describes him as standing astounded and perplexed, like a man lost in a waking nightmare. The psychological blow was absolute. His perfect plan had been dismantled before his eyes without a single drop of blood being spilled. Gladwin let the moment hang in the air before delivering a short, sharp reply. He promised friendship and protection if they proved worthy of it, but threatened swift and terrible vengeance if they ever tried such a scheme again. The council was over. The chiefs, defeated and humiliated, filed out of the room. Pontiac, trying to save face, promised he would return in a few days with his people to prove their peaceful intentions. In a move that was later heavily criticized, Gladwin simply let them go. He didn't take a single chief hostage. To his officers, it seemed like madness, but Gladwin likely reasoned that holding them without an overt act of violence would be seen as dishonorable, or perhaps he still didn't grasp the sheer scale of the conspiracy arrayed against him. He mistook a failed assassination for the end of the affair. He was wrong. Pontiac retreated to his village, enraged and mortified, but his resolve had only hardened. He interpreted Gladwin's mercy not as strength, but as weakness. The British commander knew about the plot, yet did nothing. To Pontiac, this meant they were either fools or cowards. The secret was out, but the war was just beginning. Humiliation was not a feeling Pontiac tolerated well. Instead of retreating to lick his wounds, he returned to Fort Detroit the very next morning, on May 8th, with a new strategy. Pure, unadulterated deception. He brought only 3 chiefs with him this time, and in his hands he carried the calumet, the sacred peace pipe, an object of immense spiritual significance. He approached Major Gladwin with a look of wounded innocence, claiming that evil birds had sung lies in the Major's ears. He insisted his intentions were peaceful, that his heart was true to his English brothers. As a final flourish of his supposed sincerity, he presented the sacred pipe to Captain Campbell, a respected veteran officer, leaving it in his care as a solemn pledge of peace. It was a masterful performance, a calculated act of manipulation designed to make the British question what they had seen the day before. That afternoon, the fields near the fort erupted with the sounds of a massive game of lacrosse. The shouts and cheers of the warriors were meant to project an air of carefree normalcy, a clever bit of psychological misdirection to cover what was really happening. While the garrison watched the noisy spectacle, Pontiac was elsewhere, hidden from view, holding a secret war council. He met with the chiefs of the Potawatomi and Wyandot, no longer asking for their help but demanding it. One faction of the Wyandot, influenced by a local priest, had refused to join his war. Pontiac gave them an ultimatum: join him or be destroyed. The threat worked. The next morning, after attending a final mass, the reluctant Wyandot warriors agreed to take up the hatchet. The alliance was now complete. On the morning of May 9th, Pontiac approached the fort for the last time, but not with a handful of chiefs. Behind him was a vast assembly of warriors from the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Wyandot, and Ojibwa tribes. But this time, the gate didn't open. It remained shut and barred. Major Gladwin had seen enough. Through an interpreter, he shouted from the walls that Pontiac could enter alone if he wished to talk. But his army of followers was not welcome. This was the final rejection, the end of all pretense. Thwarted and publicly defied, Pontiac's face contorted with a look of pure hatred. He threw off the mask of diplomacy for good. Turning to his followers, he gave a sharp command, and the warriors instantly scattered, yelling like fiends as they raced to unleash the violence they had planned all along. The first target was a small house outside the fort occupied by an elderly Englishwoman and her family. The warriors smashed through the door, and moments later, the first tragic scalp whoop of the siege echoed through the air. Another group ran to the river, paddled to a nearby island, and fell upon a retired British sergeant named Fisher, killing him and taking his scalp. While his men were engaged in these brutal, scattered attacks, Pontiac was making a strategic move. In a fury, he ordered his entire Ottawa village to be dismantled and moved across the river, setting up a new war camp at a place called Parents Creek, a site that would soon earn the name Bloody Run. Dressed now in full war regalia, he performed a frantic war dance, recounting his past deeds and whipping his warriors into a frenzy for the real battle to come. At dawn the next day, May 10th, the full fury of Pontiac's Confederacy was unleashed. From every direction at once, a massive force of nearly 600 warriors opened fire on the fort. The air filled with the sound of a hornet's nest as musket balls hammered into the wooden palisades. The attackers were not a disorganized mob. They fought with skill, using every outbuilding, fence, and depression in the ground for cover, constantly moving to avoid becoming easy targets. The garrison, now fully alert to their reality, returned fire with a steady, disciplined resolve. The siege had truly begun. For 6 hours, the firefight raged, a chaotic stalemate until the British employed a bit of frontier ingenuity. They heated cannonballs and iron spikes red hot and fired them into a cluster of barns and sheds, providing cover for a large group of warriors. The buildings burst into flames, forcing the attackers to bolt into the open, breaking the momentum of their assault. As the day wore on, the warriors, seeing little gain for their efforts, gradually withdrew. The first great attack was over. Inside the fort, only 5 soldiers had been wounded. A long and brutal siege was just getting started. After the fury of the first major assault died down, Major Gladwin found himself in a dangerous position. He had held the fort, but he was isolated, undermanned, and most critically, running out of food. He still clung to the belief that this uprising was a temporary, hot-headed outburst that would burn itself out. He reasoned that if he could just open a dialogue, perhaps buy some time and secure some provisions, the situation might resolve itself. It was a critical miscalculation that underestimated his opponent's strategic brilliance. Gladwin sent out his interpreter, a man named Laboute, accompanied by 2 elderly French Canadians, to negotiate with Pontiac. Their mission was to ask the chief why he had attacked and to propose a council to clear the air. It was a move born of desperation, and Pontiac could smell it from a mile away. The Ottawa chief received the delegation with a disarming kindness. He listened patiently, agreed to their proposals, and played the part of the reasonable leader who had been wronged. His performance was so convincing that Laboute returned to the fort with optimistic news, suggesting that a few well-chosen gifts might smooth everything over. The bait was set. When Laboute returned to Pontiac's camp, the chiefs made a new request. They would gladly talk peace, but they insisted on speaking with Captain Campbell, the fort's second-in-command. Campbell was an old, respected veteran who had known the local tribes for years. They trusted him, they said. His presence would guarantee a fruitful discussion. Back in the fort, Gladwin's suspicions flared. It felt like a trap. But Captain Campbell, a man whose honor sometimes outpaced his caution, wouldn't hear of it. He had spent years building relationships with these very men. He genuinely believed that his personal reputation and the bonds of friendship he had forged would protect him. He insisted on going, convinced that he alone could defuse the crisis. Overruling Gladwin's objections, Campbell walked out of the fort's gate with Lieutenant MacDougall and several Canadian guides, marching toward what he believed was a peace talk. A warning message from a concerned Frenchman was sent after them, but it arrived too late. As the officers approached the Ottawa camp, the air of calm negotiation vanished, replaced by a terrifying wall of sound, the war cries and howls of hundreds of warriors. They were immediately surrounded, and the women of the tribe tried to force them into the horrifying ritual of running the gauntlet. Just as the chaos reached a fever pitch, Pontiac stepped forward. He silenced the crowd with a single gesture, a demonstration of his absolute authority. He greeted the terrified officers with a handshake and led them into a large lodge, seating them with a display of formal courtesy. The lodge quickly filled with warriors, their faces painted for war, their expressions unreadable. They sat in dead silence as Captain Campbell, summoning all his courage, delivered his speech. His words fell into a void. No one replied. The only sound was his own voice, echoing in a room full of dark, inscrutable faces staring back at him. When he finished and stood to leave, Pontiac motioned for him to sit back down. "My father," the chief said with chilling finality, "will sleep tonight in the lodges of his red children." The betrayal was complete. They were hostages. The officers were taken to the house of a French Canadian, their lives now bargaining chips in Pontiac's game. Their only guarantee of safety was the fact that Gladwin held 2 native prisoners inside the fort. The next day, the siege began in earnest. 600 warriors resumed their attack, firing on the fort from dawn till dusk. Pontiac sent a message demanding surrender, promising the British safe passage if they would leave their ships, weapons, and all their goods behind. Gladwin's refusal was blunt and immediate. The garrison's morale began to fray under the strain of constant attack and dwindling rations, but they were reassured by their French allies that the natives would never risk a full-scale assault. For the tribes, military honor lay in achieving victory without suffering losses. A victory that cost even one warrior's life was considered a poor trade. This understanding turned the conflict into a grinding war of attrition, with the garrison fighting off daily attacks, sleeping in their clothes with guns at their sides, while the 2 armed schooners on the river provided critical covering, fire, and a lifeline to the outside world. The siege had become a bloody, miserable routine. A long siege is a war of hunger, and by mid-May, everyone around Detroit was starving. Inside the fort, the British garrison was reduced to collecting scraps, carefully rationing every last barrel of flour and ounce of grease. Their survival depended entirely on the quiet heroism of a few friendly French-Canadian families. Under the cover of darkness, men like Monsieur Bebe would sneak cattle and provisions to the fort's water gate, a clandestine supply line that kept the redcoats from starvation. But outside the walls, Pontiac's warriors were facing their own supply crisis. Having started the war with a characteristic lack of long-term planning, they were now hungry and desperate. They began to fan out along the river, demanding food from the French settlers. These were not polite requests. Families were threatened with tomahawks, their livestock was stolen and often wastefully slaughtered, and their fields were trampled. The French, caught between two warring powers, were paying the price for a conflict they didn't want. Pushed to the breaking point, a delegation of 15 of the most respected French elders decided they had no choice but to confront the war chief himself. They marched to Pontiac's headquarters, the house of a settler named Meloche, where the British officers Campbell and McDougall were being held captive. Before the lead spokesman could even voice their complaints, Pontiac, with his uncanny ability to read a situation, cut him off and demanded to know why they had come. The old Canadian laid out their grievances. Their farms were being plundered, their families terrorized. He ended with a veiled threat, reminding Pontiac that their French father, the king, would surely punish the tribes for mistreating his children when he inevitably returned from Montreal. What followed was not an apology, but a masterclass in political maneuvering. Pontiac listened patiently, then rose to speak. He began by deflecting, blaming the looting on his undisciplined young men, a classic leadership tactic to absorb a complaint without accepting personal fault. Then, he masterfully reframed the entire war. This wasn't his fight, he declared, it was their shared struggle. I am a Frenchman, he announced, and I wish to die a Frenchman. He was not just an Ottawa chief, he was the avenger of both the natives and the French, united against the hated British. He reminded them of a debt, recalling an episode 17 years earlier when he and his warriors had saved their settlement from an attack by the Fox Nation. Did I not, he asked, defend you all from hereditary slavery? His request was simple. He only asked for food to sustain his warriors while he fought their common enemy. Once the British were driven out, he promised, his people would disappear back into the forest to await the glorious return of the French king. The speech completely disarmed the delegation. They had come with complaints and left as allies in his cause. Even more remarkably, Pontiac immediately backed his words with action. To stop the random looting, he established a commissariat, an organized supply system unheard of for a Native American army. He personally toured every French farm, assessing their stock, and issued a formal levy, determining exactly what each family could spare. He appointed a French Canadian to act as his quartermaster, who collected all the provisions at Meloche's house and distributed them fairly to the warriors. To compensate the settlers, Pontiac invented his own currency. He issued promissory notes on pieces of birch bark, each one signed with his personal totem, the otter. It was a stunning display of administrative genius, and in a testament to his honor, every single note was later paid in full. This was the mind of Pontiac. He was a man of extraordinary, adaptable intelligence, a stark contrast to the rigid traditions of many native leaders. His enemies, the men who feared him most, were also the ones who respected his intellect. General Thomas Gage called his abilities extraordinary, and Major Robert Rogers, who knew him personally, praised his sharp and subtle genius and majestic and princely bearing. Pontiac's authority wasn't handed down by law or custom, it was forged in the fire of his own intellect and personality. He held a notoriously independent people together through sheer force of will. He was a man of contradictions, capable of both profound treachery and incredible nobility. When Rogers later sent him a gift of brandy, Pontiac drank it without hesitation to show he did not suspect poison from a man whose life he had once saved. His power was absolute, his leadership legendary, and his war for the soul of the continent was far from over. Pontiac's secret plot was exposed, but his real war had just begun. He managed a brutal siege with birch bark currency and sheer force of will, proving a war chief could be more cunning than a king. History forgets that the most brilliant plans often come from the side that was ultimately doomed. If you learned something uncomfortable today, subscribe. There's plenty more.